For all verified facts, subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome. The COVID-19 disease is still evolving and quite rapidly so. We have over 4 million cases in India now, and that's a much bigger number than where we started out. And perhaps we were far more cautious earlier than we are today. But as we look for treatments and cures and vaccines, two things stand out. One is that to what extent do we understand the drugs that are being pushed out in the system better than we did a little while ago? Secondly, as companies push out these drugs and doctors administer them, what do we as patients know about these drugs? And in as much as we want these drugs, are we aware of the conditions under which or around which those drugs have been introduced into the system? So to what extent, finally, are we taking a risk as we are, even in this evolving situation where we are obviously desperate for some kind of treatment, even as we wait for a cure, and we know the information that is available to us or is sufficiently available to us. So what it boils down to obviously is, do we have all the answers? And more importantly, are we asking the right questions before we take those drugs if we were unfortunately to be in that condition or situation where we have to take those drugs, particularly if we are in a mild or more than mild, rather moderate to severe case of COVID-19 that, of course, many people are in this country facing. So to get a sense and to launch into this primer, I'm now joined by Dr. P Kalantri, Director and Professor and Medical Superintendent at the Kasturba Hospital in Sevagram near Nagpur. Dr. Rajesh Kumar, former head of the School of Public Health at PGIMER Chandigarh, and also now a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He is a public health surveillance expert and a disease burden estimation expert. And finally, Murli Neelakanthan, lawyer and former Global General Counsel at CIPLA and Glenmark. Thank you all for joining me. Dr. Kalantri, let me begin with you. So we are at a situation where we are obviously still desperately hunting for a treatment for COVID-19. What is it? What is the background, or what is the backdrop that people should be looking at when they take a treatment that is given to them by doctors, wherever in the country or for that matter in the world?
Well, I agree that the situations are very desperate. They are very testing and trying times. And this COVID-19 has really emerged as a black swan. Yeah. But I strongly believe that even though the conditions are very desperate, we should not abandon science and abandon medicine during these times. In fact, this is all the more reason that we badly need very well-designed, properly conducted, numerically strong, randomized controlled trials on the basis of which we should take decisions. Instead, if we start taking decisions on the basis of anecdotes, stories, personal experiences, whims, fancies, and whatnot, we will be doing a great disservice to the medicine, and probably we will be ending with more chaos and more confusion. So even during desperate times, it is extremely important to first try the test drug to make sure that that intervention really works, to prove the benefits and the risks of that intervention, and then to apply that intervention at the patient's bedside. Instead, what we see today is a morbid proliferation of very untested medicines which are being used right, left, and center without any scientific evidence to the merits of these drugs. It started with azithromycin, doxycycline, favipiravir, ivermectin, then interleukin-6 inhibitors, convalescent plasma, and so on. But right now, except dexamethasone and remdesivir, do not have a proven evidence that this does really help in either reducing mortality or making the patients leave hospital. So I strongly believe as a physician that during this desperate testing and trying times, it is the moral and ethical duty of all physicians to ensure that their treatments are based on proper scientific evidence, on well-tested principles of ethics and medicine, and those principles are applied at the patient's bedside. And we should not be laying our hands on almost every drug which looks promising, which has probably worked in petri tissues on animal studies, but which has not proved its benefit on human beings.
Okay. Dr. Kumar, what's your opening remarks? How are you viewing this from your vantage point as someone who is public health surveillance expert. How do you see what the situation where drugs are obviously being administered to some extent, or to a large extent, maybe doctors have no choice. So there is a demand for this, maybe not just from doctors, but even from patients.
Yes, I think there is a demand, and now demand has been generated also. You see, the situation has come to such an extent that, when doctors, hospitals, they are not able to save a patient, because we know epidemiologically that most of the patients, they don't need any treatment. Most of the patients, they recover. The percentage may be 60%, 70%, it depends. Some patients need some supportive therapy. If you have fever, you need paracetamol. If you have cough, you need, some medicine to, take care of that. So some symptomatic treatment to give comfort to the patient, but ultimately it is patient's body which fights out the disease, and this category of patients, they also come out, they recover. And there is a group of patients where, you try whatever you can, and still they succumb to the disease. This is a very small fraction of the total people who are affected by it. But this is the last fraction, which is a small fraction, where even physicians are now not in a position, or not daring to tell the families that we do not have a definite, scientifically proven treatment for the virus. You see, and rather will give some kind of this thing that you bring this drug, that drug. If we would have had that drug, if we would have had plasma therapy, we might have saved the patient. Trying to, rather than a physician, this is the duty of the physician. If he's not able to help the patient in the last minute, one should say so, rather than making an excuse. And now patients are like feeling guilty, relatives are like feeling guilty that we could not provide this, we could not provide that. And all these things are not, don't have any scientific basis. Actually, we had a long movement in medicine to make medicine more scientific, evidence-based medicine. I think this is not a crisis as an epidemic. This has created another crisis for medicine as such. The gains which medicine made in last 50, 70 years, they are being lost. I think medicine is heading towards medieval times. And the kind of unethical practices which you are seeing, if you permit me, I would just let you know that one of the manufacturers of the drug prepared a social media post and circulated it widespread, and personally meeting not the doctors, not trying to convince the doctors, but trying to convince the political leadership and the administrative leadership. And then they are coming back to the doctors. Why not try this one? You see, so in my opinion, the way things are going on, people may lose trust on even some therapies which might be genuinely scientifically tested in future, because they are now trying to see through this game, that things, very, very costly things, they are being asked to procure for their near and dear ones.
Right. But, the two medicines, I mean, Dr. Kalantri also mentioned, for instance, let's say remdesivir, favipiravir. Are you saying, Dr. Kumar, that these have no impact, or we don't know whether they work at all?
Yeah, I think we do not have enough robust evidence to state very emphatically that they reduce mortality. So some studies are there, but those studies do not go to that extent. You see, and in the name of emergency, some regulatory authorities in various countries, they have under some pressure without examining the data properly, without, putting it to the profession, without making it public, what are the bases of taking those decisions? They just take decisions. And then, not only that, then they find place in the government prescribed guidelines. They enter into government prescribed guidelines. And then it is very difficult to challenge for anybody, because then there are some kind of regulation also in this country. If you say something which government has included in the guideline, then what can happen to those people under the prevailing rules and regulations and laws, under the disaster management, etc.
Right. Okay, I'm going to come back on that. Murli Neelakantan, can you give us a sense, from a drug manufacturer's point of view, what is the process that a drug goes through in normal times, and what is it going through today, which either is par for course or not par for course?
So the Drugs Act doesn't distinguish between emergency situations, pandemic situations, normal times, abnormal times. So there is no distinction. There is no special category of approval because somebody believes it to be an emergency. So let's start from there. The law does not distinguish between the two scenarios. In India, other countries have situations where you can have emergency use, emergency authorization. India doesn't have it. So that's a very clear statement, very clearly understood, that you can't make exceptions because there is an emergency or someone declares an emergency. That is not what the Drugs Act contemplates. It doesn't allow it. So if you start from there, the same process that was adopted in 2018 and 19 needs to be carried on in 2020 as well. So nothing changes. It starts with what happens in the lab. So you discover a chemical substance. Existing literature tells you that it might work in a particular scenario. You then take it from that to animals. So you start with mice. You then go to perhaps dog, rabbit, monkey, and then you say, yeah, we're getting consistent results. It's all looking great. Then you go to the drugs regulator and say, we want to do a phase 1 trial, which is we want to see if this is safe in humans, for which you have to provide all of the data of the scientific work you have done, all the literature that shows that it works, and then you do a safety trial. After which you go to phase 2, which is dosing. Let's figure out how much of this it can take, what are the parameters around which this can be taken. Assuming that works great, you go to phase 3, which is efficacy. Does it actually work in a human being? So all of this usually takes lots of months, just the trial stage. Forget the discovery stage. Assuming you have a drug that works in the lab, the trial stage itself could take years sometimes, and definitely not weeks. So we're talking several months, perhaps years, but definitely not weeks. Once all of this data is available, you submit it to the drug regulator, who looks at all of this and says, yes, it's all scientific, it all works, and it works in these prescribed circumstances. So even when you get approval, at the final stage, you still have to provide prescribing information, contraindication, what is the label, what is the advice you're giving to doctors, what is the information you're giving to doctors, what is this education that you're going to do to doctors. All of that material needs to be supplied to the drug regulator so that you don't try and play around the edges. It is exceptionally important that you make sure everything is specifically detailed in that, so nobody can play around the edges. In my mind, what we're seeing now is that play where people are saying, at least drug manufacturers who've got these emergency or restricted uses, are trying to play around the edges. And the authorities, wanting to show that they are unfortunately doing something, are allowing this to happen. So I understand that patients and people want the government to do something, and there is always this pressure to do something. Unfortunately, this has told us that the institutional structure, the laws that we have in place, the regulations that we have in place, are being in some ways hijacked by this urge to do something. And therefore, we're seeing these exceptional circumstances being used to do what the law doesn't allow you to do. That's a big danger.
Right. Okay. Let me come back to you, Dr. Kalantri. So we are in an interesting situation because many of these medicines that are being used for treatment are obviously not new medicines. It's not something that has just emerged from the laboratory. They were always there, but were used for different circumstances. And again, there is the demand side where obviously patients and governments who represent, at least are supposed to represent the interests of the common person or citizen will maybe act because they have to show some. So this is, first of all, if it is a medicine that has been around, then do the same rules apply? Number two, when you are in a situation when there is unprecedented demand, emotional pressure, how do you then balance the two sides?
There is no balancing in science. Let's understand this. Either it's a fact and it works, or it's not a fact and it doesn't work. There is no balancing to be done here. You can't balance fact against belief. That is not how the regulations work. You can't balance law against murder and say, yes, there is a good reason for it. You can't do this. The law doesn't contemplate it. Science doesn't contemplate it. So that's a very simple scenario. When there is an urge to do something, you must stop and ask, is this permitted by law? Is this allowed by law? On the question of a new drug or an existing drug, the regulations don't distinguish between the two. So if you find a new use for an existing drug, you still have to do the trials in exactly the same way as if it was a new substance. In fact, the definition is very clear. So these are simple regulations. They are not complicated. They are very good regulations.
Right.
The difficulty we have is the humans that regulate are not that simple and not that straightforward, perhaps.
Okay, let me come to you, Dr. Kalantri. How are you seeing this from a physician's point of view? So, there is a patient in front of you. There are some existing medicines approved for different uses at a different point of time. And there is pressure to obviously administer something for patients who are in either a critical situation or suffering from severe symptoms. So how do you then find the balance?
Well, let me give you a very specific example, and let me cite hydroxychloroquine. Now, hydroxychloroquine as a drug has been with us for last several decades. It's a well-known drug. It has worked well in autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, etc. The researchers also point out that it has worked well against the coronavirus in petri dishes, in animal experiments, etc. So extrapolating those animal studies and petri dishes studies, isn't it? Why not use this drug and why not repurpose it for coronavirus? And the people might say that who knows, it might work as well in corona also. And this is how the hope and hype was built around hydroxychloroquine in January, February, and March. And then came randomized controlled trials, and trial after trial published in New England Journal of Medicine kept on showing that when hydroxychloroquine is used in patients with mild disease, moderate disease, severe disease, pre-exposure, post-exposure prophylaxis, well, it doesn't help at all. So this very clearly shows that there are certain concepts which might look very appealing on paper. They look very logical. They might work in animal studies. They do wonders on petri dishes. But when they are extrapolated and they are used in real life situations on thousands of patients, they often fall flat and do not work as well as they were believed to be. So the point is, there's no point in going by emotions. Right now, what we are doing is that the God has gifted us with a pair of brains, the left brain and the right brain. The left brain is very logical, it is mathematical, and the right brain is very emotional, very intuitive. Right now, we have probably switched off our left brain and we have all started using our right brains. And right now, our emotions are overriding the science, the logic, and the evidence. So as I keep on saying that, I agree that there are very desperate times. You are seeing patients dying before you. You are seeing patients being admitted to the ICU, being mechanically ventilated, developing multi-organ failure. You are seeing unfortunate deaths, etc., etc. And there is a natural urge to do something, but that natural urge or that temptation to do something because it might work or because it looks very promising on paper should be strongly resisted. Let me give an example that way back in 1799, the US President George Washington died. And he died because he had developed an acute bacterial infection of throat called acute epiglottitis. And he was being treated by the most reputed, most knowledgeable, and most wise doctors in the United States at that time. And the history tells us that George Washington did not die of bacterial infections, but he was killed by his physicians. Because at that time, they all felt that, well, he has got a bad blood. The best way to treat him would be do a venesection and take off as much blood as we can. And within 24 hours, they took out about 2.5 liters of blood from George Washington's body. And this poor US president dies not because of an infection, but probably because of a hypovolemic shock, because his doctors felt that that was the best treatment. So often what we feel right, or what our right brain thinks makes us believe that it is right, may not be true. And therefore it's all the more reason that we go by science, we go by evidence, we go by good clinical trials, and we should ensure that, well, let the data dictate and drive our treatment at the patient's bedside.
Right. Dr. Kumar, let me come to you. So we are now talking about randomized controlled trials, which is considered maybe one of the most efficient ways of trying to understand, at least from, let's say, a layperson's point of view, whether a drug has been put through the process or a new drug has been put through the process. So tell us about how can one ask the right questions when it comes to randomized controlled trials and its application or its applicability in a new drug.
Yeah, I think these procedures are well known to scientific community, and this has a history of more than half century to use these procedures. I think do no harm is the first thing that we should not do any harm. And even if we don't cause any benefit, who knows? Many of these modalities of treatments which are now being used are causing iatrogenic effects. Some of these patients might otherwise come out because of their body defenses, but the side effects of these drugs might be pushing them over. So I think we have now there is no dearth of scientists. There is no, we have a well-established research system in the country for randomized control trial. What limiting factors you have is number of patients. We have sufficient number of patients, in the country. There is no such situation that sufficient number of hospitals, sufficient number of scientists who are working in the hospitals. I think this is in this situation. This is not a situation where you cannot conduct randomized control trials. You see, and even before randomized control trial, now by this time, India should have sufficient data, even from the observations, to see that where the things are going, and then launch randomized trials. Even some of the randomized trials which were started in India, they are not seeing the light of the day. For example, plasma therapy. It was announced that there is a randomized control trial. So where are the results? Interim results. So I think we are like trying to do something for reasons other than medical reasons. As you mentioned in your intro, there is a pressure on our governments to do something, appear to be doing something. So I think instead of coming out transparently to the people, I think that should be the, ethically, this is how the issue should be dealt. So I would say still that it is possible to do randomized control trials for drugs, at least for the drugs which have been already used for some other indications, because we know about those drugs. So it is much easier because some of the steps you can start from, like some studies which already have some results. So it becomes a little bit easier to do trials on humans for those drugs. I think that route should have been taken. And then, the profession and the public and everybody will have more trust into those things.
Right, and that's a good point. Let me work backwards. Murli, let me begin with you. So, what is the ideal randomized controlled trial process that a drug should go through, and what can I, as a potential user of that, ask as a question? And secondly, who can I trust? Because drug companies will always produce drugs with an incentive. Many of them are listed companies. They have shareholders to answer for. In some cases, as we've seen in vaccines in the United States, people have cashed out because share prices have moved up on anticipation. So there is all that world, and we cannot wish away that world either.
So I'll answer the second part of the question, but I think your two other panelists have done more clinical trials than most of your viewers put together. So I will leave it to the two of them, especially Dr. Kalantri, to answer on how a trial happens. I think the practical knowledge that he has will be a lot more having done these trials. What you can trust and how you should go about trusting is based on what the law is. So the presumption here is that if a medicine has a label that says, here is the prescribing information, here is the indication, I, as a consumer, should be able to look at it. The doctor should be able to look at it and say, can I trust it? That is all a doctor or a consumer can do. That is based on the fact that the government and the regulator have followed all of those procedures to the letter. How does the government know that? By the trial data that the two gentlemen on your show will tell you how it is generated. So as far as the public is concerned, the government is concerned, the regulator is concerned, all they can do is rely on data. And if that looks good, they can't go wrong with it. And so that is really what the patient and the doctor is relying on. Now, whether that is very good, whether they can rely on it, should it be approved or not, that is the whole trial process, which I'll leave to the other two gentlemen on your show.
Right. Okay. Let me come back to you, Dr. Kumar. So, as we go ahead, what should be the couple of points that as a consumer or a potential buyer of that medicine, if God forbid I have to take it, I should be thinking about?
One thing, first thing, who is promoting that drug? So if you see the company who has produced it, they are, according to our medical ethics, this drug should not be advertised to general public through TV, radio, social media. I mean, it is prohibited. And if you some companies doing it directly and others doing it indirectly, like on the talk shows and things like that, raising discussions, inviting reputed people, saying something in favor, etc. I think that is first sign to see, that something unethical is going on. Otherwise, why should a company promote it in that manner? This is first thing. Second thing is that, the patients and relatives, they should not come under pressure of advertisements or these discussions and then start asking their physicians to use physicians, if he's an ethical physician, will decide the modality of treatment according to the condition of the patients. Number 3, the doctors, physicians, when they declare that the person, they are helpless, they could not save the person, should say straightforward that, this is beyond, we are helpless in this matter, as we are in many other conditions also, And very transparently, doctor should have the courage to say that I could not help this patient transparently, rather than saying I did not have this drug, that drug, or if you would have brought me this thing, that thing, I would have done wonders. So these 3 things, I think if a doctor is saying these things to the patient, then they should be,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Dr. Kumar, you're breaking up, but I think I've got your 3 points. Let me come to Dr. Kalantri for his last word. Dr. Kalantri, as you know, things are not improving. If things were improving, maybe the conversation could have been a little more, calmer, perhaps. It is getting worse, and at least in India. And we are obviously more desperate now for more treatment as maybe more patients come to hospitals and so on, while even as we find, let's say, better public health policy responses to this growing challenge. So your word of either caution or advice to people who unfortunately will contract this disease and perhaps suffer, let's say, either moderate or severe conditions?
Well, all my professional life, I have never seen a viral disease being treated by at least a dozen drugs. Never. Isn't it? So this is probably the first instance in the history where probably a dozen drugs are competing with each other for a viral disease. So the point is that we need to first assure people that probably 80% of those who get infected with virus would have a very mild course and they would improve of their own. So all that they need to do is just swallow a few tablets of paracetamol, take some rest, have mental tranquility, and they would be fine. About 15% patients might deteriorate and they would need probably oxygen in the hospital. They are the patients who would probably improve with remdesivir, but remdesivir has not been shown to decrease mortality in 3 separate trials. Those patients who are now severely ill, they are on mechanical ventilators, they require high amount of oxygen in the hospital. The only proven medicine is right now dexamethasone, which the recovery trial has very clearly shown that in such condition, it reduces mortality by almost 1/3 to 1/5. None of the other medicines which are being promoted in the market and which are being very popular in the press, media, even in the lay people, well, it doesn't work. What I would strongly urge here is that more than medicines here, what counts here is a team of very dedicated, conscientious, knowledgeable doctors, nurses, and paramedics. It is there that teamwork that counts. Probably drugs, interventions, etc., play a very minor role in the entire treatment of COVID-19. But what we have done is that we have shifted all our attention from this army of good healthcare workers, our residents, interns, intensivists, nurses, biomedical engineers, the monitoring people, to drugs. I think that emphasis should go back to those doctors and nurses who are right now spending sleepless nights in the hospitals, fighting with the virus, dedicating their life to save these patients, and probably a good medical care in a good ICU, in a good public health hospital, where evidence and science dictates the treatment, and your treatment is not dictated by the commerce part, which probably do more good than harm.
Right. I do wish that that happens, and I do wish we are depending and will depend on our fine frontline medical staff, including doctors and nurses, to give the best care, and hopefully drugs are the last resort, as they should be for and at all times in our lives. Murli Nilkandan, Dr. Rajesh Kumar, and Dr. S. P. Kalantri, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.